Hello and welcome to today's edition of News for English Learners. Today's vocabulary in the news is concerning the potential property crisis in the Chinese market and the knock-on effects that might have in other countries where China has invested massively in recent years, in particular infrastructure projects. In this particular case, we'll be talking about a whole new city that was supposed to be built in Malaysia on reclaimed islands. And the fact that it has been delayed and has hit a lot of problems has meant that it is largely empty as of today. So, as usual, we'll read through the article together, highlight any interesting words or phrases that we come across, and talk about them and try to help you understand them. So, let's begin with the first paragraph. It was supposed to be a new urban paradise in the heart of Malaysia, a massive development of luxury condos, office towers, shopping malls, and parks. But Forest City, a joint venture between a Malaysian conglomerate and a Chinese state-owned company, has turned into a ghost town amid the COVID-19 pandemic and geopolitical tensions. The project was launched in 2014 with the aim of attracting wealthy investors from China and beyond. The situation is symptomatic of the wider crisis that has engulfed the Chinese property sector, which accounts for a quarter of the country's GDP and is burdened by a massive debt load. So if we turn to the first phrase we have highlighted here in yellow, this is joint venture. Now, probably it's better to take these two parts individually. If we start with joint, well, a common use of this word is to describe parts of the body, such as the elbow, the knee, and the wrist. These parts are also called articulations, but commonly known as joints. They are called joints because they are parts of the body where there is a connection. Connection between the hand and the arm is called the wrist. This is a joint. So joint is connected with the verb join, or to connect. When you join things together, you connect them. In this case, the joint in question is connected with business. It's when two parties join together to undertake some kind of project, usually because it's a very expensive project. The second word, venture, looks a little bit like adventure, and it is, I suppose, related to that, because the two parties are taking a risk, right? The risk is spread between the two, so each individual party is less exposed than they would be if they were doing it alone, but there is still a risk. One joint venture that I know of from history was the development of Concorde between the British government and the French government. That project, which was to develop the world's first supersonic aircraft, commercial aircraft, was obviously extremely expensive and therefore risky. So the two governments decided to pool their resources and conduct it as a joint venture. Both parties invested money in the project and therefore minimizing the risk to each one. So in this case, the joint venture in question was between a Malaysian business and a Chinese state-owned company. And the project was to build this whole new city in Malaysia, in the heart of Malaysia, so in the center of Malaysia. So let's move on. If we look at the first word, ghost, well, this may be familiar to some of you if you're fans of horror films. Ghosts were supposedly the spirit forms of people who had died, who stayed in a certain place and haunted a house or an old building. And the idea in this phrase is that the town itself doesn't have any people left. They've left. There's no people, there's no animals, there's no traffic. perhaps only the ghosts remain. So it is empty completely, usually abandoned for one of a variety of reasons. If we think of the Chernobyl disaster, which happened quite a long time ago, the towns nearby to the Chernobyl reactor had to be completely evacuated. So they were turned into ghost towns literally overnight. There are other examples of ghost towns. They could be abandoned for economic reasons. Sometimes towns grow up spontaneously due to particular circumstances. If we think of the West in the United States, quite often they would find gold, and people, miners and their families and everybody else, would rush to the area, set up a new town, which would grow pretty quickly. And then when the gold was exhausted or when it became more difficult to find, the whole reason for the town's existence disappeared. So it would gradually be abandoned and would turn into a ghost town. In this case, of course, neither of those two examples applies, because this is a ghost town because it hasn't been occupied in the first place. It has been built perhaps without thought to the actual demand for this kind of accommodation. I think it was largely built to try to attract Chinese people to buy their properties. And as we'll see later, there were several difficulties to that. And perhaps there's not enough local demand, or perhaps the local people cannot afford to buy. So for that reason, most of the units, most of the flats and apartments are empty. So therefore, it could be defined as a ghost town. So moving on to the next word we have here, this is the regular verb to engulf. This is a word we often find associated with things, perhaps natural disasters like fires or floods, because when something is engulfed, it means that it is covered in something or surrounded by something. A house, perhaps, that is burning, you could say, has been engulfed in flames when the flames are completely covering the building. Land can be engulfed with water when there is a flood, when a river bursts its bank. In this case, we're talking metaphorically, really. So nothing is literally covered, but metaphorically, the whole of the construction sector in China has been affected, has been overwhelmed by this crisis, which is spreading now to other countries that have received significant investments from the Chinese construction sector. We can also use it to talk about political scandals as well. We can say the government has been engulfed by this political scandal. It has affected the whole of the government, and they're really feeling the pressure of that. So let's move on to the next paragraph. The developers claimed that Forest City would eventually house 700,000 residents and create 220,000 jobs. They also boasted of its eco-friendly features, such as solar panels, rainwater harvesting, and electric vehicles. But Forest City is largely deserted and risks becoming a white elephant. Only a fraction of the planned buildings have been completed, and most of them are empty. The few residents who live there complain of a lack of amenities and services. The pandemic stopped construction work and deterred potential buyers, and the political climate has soured, as Malaysia and China have clashed over trade, investment, and territorial disputes. So turning to the first word we have here, this is a regular verb, to boast. So essentially this verb, boast, means to talk incessantly about your own abilities, achievements, or possessions. It's not usually considered a positive thing. People often don't like hearing nonstop about how good somebody is or what they have achieved. And for that reason, people tend to try to avoid it. But some characters cannot help themselves. They are a little bit self-obsessed, perhaps, and they can't help boasting about perhaps the new car that they've just bought, or how good they are at playing tennis. or perhaps some achievement. Maybe you've just got a new job and you just can't stop telling everybody about it. Probably the other people won't necessarily want to hear about it, but maybe you feel so good, you feel so proud of yourself that you just can't stop talking. In this case, it was the developers of the city who were constantly emphasizing and talking about its supposed ecologically friendly features, such as power generation via solar panels, collecting of rainwater, and also the use of electric vehicles. So they were talking about that and emphasizing that characteristic. Therefore, we can use this verb to boast. And by the way, the adjective form of this verb is boastful. So if you think somebody is talking about their own achievements too much, overemphasizing in a proud way, then perhaps you would call them boastful. So the next word we have here is two words, phrase, rainwater harvesting. And I just mentioned this when I spoke about boasting. I said that the rainwater was collected. That is essentially what this refers to. To harvest is connected with agriculture originally. So the farmer would prepare the land, he would plow the land, then he would sow the seeds, wait for the plants to grow, and finally, when the plants were ready to be collected, they would be harvested. And in the past, of course, this was done largely by hand. People would go along and use a hand tool to collect or pick the fruit from the trees. Now, of course, it's in modern economies, it's largely done by machines. There is actually a very large machine called a combine harvester, which collects cereals, crops like wheat, and it does it in a very efficient and very fast way. So that is the original meaning of harvest, to collect the crops. And obviously, in this case, the meaning is similar, but instead of collecting crops, you're collecting rainwater. So I suppose that this city was built so that as the rain fell and went down the drain on the street, this would flow into some kind of tank or containment area where it would be collected, perhaps recycled, or maybe stored and used at a later date for maybe watering the parks or the plants of the city. So the next word we have here is this word, deserted. Now we can see that this is used as an adjective here to describe the empty city, but it is connected with a noun, and also there is a verb form. So let's start with the noun, a desert. What is a desert? Well, the Sahara is a very famous desert in the north of Africa. So we can see from that a desert is a very arid, dry area with lots of sand. Not necessarily lots of sand, actually. There are deserts without a lot of sand, but the classical one that we think of as the Sahara Desert is largely composed of sand. But there are deserts all over the world. There's the Atacama Desert in South America. There is the Gobi Desert in Asia. So a desert is a place without a lot of trees. There's not a lot of features. It's a barren landscape. So that is the connection, really, between a desert as a noun and deserted as an adjective. Just like the desert is empty of features, you don't have any trees or many other plants or animals. A deserted city is empty of people and traffic and animals. It's completely barren and deserted, just like a desert. We should also highlight the verb here. So this is used particularly if we talk about the military. If somebody deserts the military, that means they have gone absent without leave. So they have disappeared, if you like, and they haven't returned to duty. We should also highlight that there is another word with two S's, which is pronounced desert. So it looks very similar to desert, but in this case, it refers to the course of a meal, usually the final course that we eat after the main dish, which is usually quite sweet. So it could be a cake or ice cream or pudding or mousse. That is described as a dessert. That's spelt, as I said, with two S's. So just be careful with those two words. They are quite confusingly similar. So moving on to the next phrase, we have a white elephant. And we can actually see a picture of a white elephant here. Now, normally elephants are, of course, grayish in color, but in nature, sometimes white animals are born. In fact, here in Barcelona, where I live, famously, we used to have a white gorilla, and he became very famous. He was a very famous tourist attraction because they're highly unusual. So they do sometimes occur in nature. And apparently this phrase, that a white elephant, refers to a practice that happened at some point in the past in Asia, where very powerful individuals like kings would gift a white elephant as a very expensive gift, as a sign of prestige. However, the person receiving the gift would not necessarily be very happy about that, because although they're very prestigious, very expensive, they're also very expensive to look after and maintain. So for that reason, perhaps you wouldn't be so content to receive such an animal as a gift. Now, obviously, what we are talking about here is not that. Literally, we often use the phrase a white elephant now to signify something that is very expensive, but perhaps not very useful or practical. And it's often used to talk about expensive projects, infrastructure projects, for example, that have taken up a lot of resources, and perhaps their original budget has expanded a lot due to unforeseen circumstances. And in the end, maybe when the project is finished, that infrastructure is obsolete, or maybe the circumstances have changed and it's no longer necessary or no longer as essential as it was at the beginning. So therefore, we would describe that as a white elephant. There are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of projects around the world that could be described as such, but one that I know of locally in Spain is connected with air travel. Several years ago, probably 10 to 15 years ago, there was a boom here in local towns investing in building up local airports because of the increase in cheap flights and budget airlines, usually flying to relatively small regional airports. Towns decided that they could boost their local economy by investing a lot of money in building or expanding existing airports. And the problem was that the market changed, or perhaps they didn't really understand the demand, or they didn't anticipate the demand fully. And when the project was finished, there were no flights. No airline was actually interested in flying from that airport. So in a lot of cases, they were just left and more or less abandoned without ever having served the purpose for which they were built. So we could definitely describe those as white elephants. So let's move on to the final word we have here in this paragraph, and it is the verb sour. Sour is most commonly seen as an adjective, though, in fact, and it's used to describe the taste of certain foods, things that are quite acidic. So, for example, lemon juice or vinegar or even yogurt, you could say, is slightly sour. So usually when we taste these things, they're not necessarily that pleasant. Of course, people do enjoy that flavor to an extent, but it's not the same as something sweet. If you taste something that's very sour, it might make you wince, and perhaps you don't find that totally pleasurable. And that is the sense in which it is used as a verb. When we say that a relationship has soured, it means that a once strong relationship, a good friendship, has become less strong or less friendly, if you like. perhaps something has happened. Perhaps people have lost trust with each other, and therefore the relationship is not as strong as it was. It has weakened, it has soured. And that is the case here with the relationship between China and Malaysia. The article is saying that the climate, the political climate, is not as rosy, it's not as positive as it used to be. Certain things have happened. There have been territorial disputes, there have been clashes, fights over trade and investment. This has meant that the relationship between Malaysia and China is not a positive one at the moment. And that has had an impact on Forest City, of course, because it has meant that a lot of people Chinese people who bought condominiums in the Forest City have not been able to travel there because they can't get visas. So let's move on to the final paragraph for today. I regret buying a unit here, said Lee, a businessman who bought a 2-bedroom condo in Forest City for $284,000. There's nothing to do here. The shops are closed, the facilities are poor, the security is lacking. I feel cheated by the developers. Lee is not alone. According to the Forest City sales office, only about 20% of the 20,000 units sold so far have been occupied. The majority of the buyers are from China, who were lured by the promise of a second home in a strategic location with a lower cost of living than in mainland China. But many of them have been unable to visit or move to Forest City due to travel restrictions and visa issues. So we have 3 words here highlighted. The first one is facilities. This is a noun. When we talk about the facilities in a town or city, what we're really talking about here is all of the necessary things that we use in a daily or weekly basis. So obviously, one of the basic needs we have is food. So we could describe the shops and the supermarkets as a facility. Also, sometimes we need to go to the doctor. So medical facilities are necessary. We need to educate our children. So schools, colleges, universities, those are educational facilities. Facilities are basically all of those things that we normally commonly find in a city or town, apart from the actual places where people live. So banks would be another example, hairdressers, dentists, the list is endless. In this case, what it's saying is that the planners or the developers did not build adequate facilities for the people who are living there. So perhaps they didn't anticipate the necessity for certain things that we've just highlighted. So moving on to the next word, we have the verb cheat. So in this case, this person, Lee, is saying that he feels like he was cheated. But if we think about the base meaning of this, to cheat, it basically means that you are not following the rules if you cheat. If we think about playing a board game, think of a game like Monopoly. It's a very common board game where people go around the board and they buy and they sell property and they try to make money. Now, if I was to steal money from the bank without the other players knowing about it, then I would be cheating. I'm not following the rules of the game. You can also cheat in an exam situation if you copy from somebody sitting next to you, if you copy the answers, or if you try in some way to get the answers to the questions in the exam by nefarious means. Perhaps you write little notes on your hand or on a piece of paper. That would also be described as cheating. And we also use the same word in relationships. So if somebody's in a long-term relationship, perhaps they're married, and they have an illicit affair, an extramarital affair, that would also be classed as cheating because you're not following the rules of the relationship. In this case, this person feels as if they have been cheated by the developers because he feels that the developers have basically taken his money, and in return, they haven't given him what he wanted. He was expecting to live in a fully developed city with adequate facilities, in a beautiful environment, very eco-friendly, and none of that has materialized. So the last phrase we have here is cost of living. Now, for many people in Europe, this is a very familiar phrase, particularly in the UK. Every time I watch the news recently, somebody is talking about the cost of living crisis. So what this is referring to is the basic necessities of life. For example, paying for accommodation, paying for food, paying for perhaps any kind of basic medical treatment, those things that we all have to pay for. If we think about how much that costs, we could say that is the cost of living, it's the cost of existing, discounting any luxuries or anything that is discretionary. So not including perhaps holidays or entertainments, which, you can live without. But the basic cost of living has been increasing a lot recently in many countries around the world, particularly in Europe, due to many things. Perhaps the war in Ukraine has had an effect on that. In the UK, Brexit has also had a major effect on that. It has caused inflation to be much higher than it has been for many years. And obviously, when inflation is high, that means everything is increasing in cost, including all of the basics. So that means that generally the cost of living is increasing. In the article, it's saying basically that people in China were attracted or lured by the promise of a second home in a location with a lower cost of living. So generally, the cost of living is higher in big cities where there's a high demand for products and accommodation. If you go to an area with a less developed economy like Malaysia, then relatively the cost of living would be a lot less. So that is one of the attractions for the people who bought those condos. Okay, so I think we have just about reached the end of today's article. Thank you for listening and reading with me, and I hope you have learned a few new words. If you have, don't forget to like the video. That really gives me positive feedback, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.